Question 7.
The Deputy well knows that if I were to divulge a price in a contract negotiation, that I'd be accused of something else. Count Corla, I propose to take questions 7 to 9 together. The role of the Social Policy and Public Service Reform Division is to assist me as Taoiseach and the Government in delivering on the programme for government objective of public policies and services which drive a socially inclusive and fair society, and to assist in renewing and transforming the public service. The Division assists the work of Cabinet Committees B, E and G and the associated senior officials groups. Cabinet Committee B covers social policy and public services, including education, children's social inclusion, Irish language, arts and culture, and continued improvements in the reform of public services. Cabinet Committee E deals with issues relating to health, including the delivery of health service reforms. And Cabinet Committee G provides political oversight of developments in relation to justice and equality issues, including implementation of the Government's programme of reform in the areas of justice and policing. The Division also provides the Secretariat for the Civil Service Management Board, which is chaired by the Secretary-General of my department. It incorporates the Programme for Government Office, which publishes regular progress reports on implementation of the PFG. Assists the Dublin North East Inner City Initiative, including through the Programme Office, Programme Implementation Board and Oversight Group, and is responsible with the National Economic and Social Council, responsible for liaison with the National Economic and Social Council, which falls under the remit of my department. The Division also provides me with briefing and speech material on social policy and public service reform issues, and participates in relevant interdepartmental committees and other groups.
McDonald.
I understand that the Minister for Justice has finally brought outstanding legal advice to Cabinet this morning that will enable his department to progress redress payments to survivors of the Magdalene laundries. A year has passed since the Ombudsman published his report of an investigation into the administration of the Magdalene redress scheme. And that investigation found a serious inconsistency in the Department's application of the redress scheme's eligibility criteria. Women recorded as admitted to a different institution closely associated with another named laundry were wrongly refused admission to the scheme. Taoiseach, even as the investigation was complete and the recommendations prepared, the first instinct of the Department was to push back. And at the Justice Committee earlier this year, Peter Tyndall told members that in his 10 years as Ombudsman, he had never reached a point where a department had, prior to publication of a report, absolutely and categorically refused to engage in the process of accepting and implementing the recommendations made. So while I welcome the belated decision to accept in full the recommendations made by the Ombudsman, I am utterly disappointed at the amount of time it has taken to do so, and more to the point, so are the women. I'm also alarmed to learn that the Department has changed the redress scheme application process to require that elderly women include the weekly hours they worked in their respective laundries. Can the Taoiseach explain why this change was made? And can he say if he believes it to be appropriate? And can you indicate, Taoiseach, that the women's applications will now be fast-tracked with payments issued before Christmas?
Deputy Howlin.
The Taoiseach, just to give information to the House in relation to the specific public service reform measures being led by this division. Are there discrete units of reform that you have prioritised and that the division is on top of? In particular, does it have oversight of the reforms in Garda Síochána? You will recall previously, certainly, all the work suggested by the Garda Inspectorate was to be driven centrally, as well as obviously a specific role for the Garda Commissioner. Does it have a role, for example, in the Slointicare reforms? Is it looking at the implementation, the timelines, the funding requirements? What in the reform agenda specifically is under remit of this division?
Deputy Richard Barrett.
As we speak, the Irish Nurses and Midwives Organisation is meeting to consider possible industrial action over the failure of your government to recognise the pay crisis, which is at the heart of our complete inability to recruit nurses into the public health service with the consequent crisis in that health service. A situation where paying conditions are so terrible that of every 4 nursing jobs that are advertised, we only get 1 application. But you refuse to take on board the need to significantly increase nurses' pay. We have teachers having rejected your plans to not restore pay equality for new entrant teachers, engaging in industrial action and potentially escalating that industrial action. I want to commend both those groups because I think they have no choice but to fight for better pay if we are going to recruit the nurses and the teachers we need to provide the staff in our public health service and our education system. But Taoiseach, relating to our earlier discussion, you see, isn't it the problem that much of the reason those nurses and teachers are having to demand extra pay or fighting for extra pay, aren't willing to work in these jobs for the pay that currently is because their pay will not allow them to put a roof over their head. And when you say we just need to ramp up supply and it's okay to sell off public land to private developers to build houses at market prices, what you're failing to recognise is building houses that nobody can afford, that teachers can't afford, that nurses can't afford, or they can't afford the rents, they can't afford the property prices, is pointless. It was, in fact, that approach to housing that led to the last economic crash. And that is why we insist, not for ideological reasons, we insist for very practical reasons, is the state needs to build public and affordable housing on public land because market prices are completely impossible for ordinary working people in this country.
Right, final question, Deputy Micheál Martin.
Yeah, I think striking things about the government's response to the interview given by Tony O'Brien to the Sunday Business Post last weekend is how it has tried to focus on one personal comment about Minister Harris and ignore everything else in the interview, particularly in relation to health policy. I think we've all noticed how there hasn't been any credible attempt to deny the other substantive claims in the interview about an obsession with media management and in particular lip service being paid to Sláinte care. We now have new figures about unprecedented vacancies in key medical posts, and all of the evidence is that this has directly impacted on services. And I raised this with you, Taoiseach, the week before last here in the Dáil. That's a very serious issue going to the very heart of the quality of care and safety for patients in our hospitals right now. And can you tell us, Taoiseach, if any proposals you intend to bring forward to address these critical shortages in terms of qualified consultants for key positions? Furthermore, Taoiseach, the decision by Fine Gael to abolish the board of the HSE has also been identified by everybody, from the Fiscal Advisory Council to the Department of Finance, as being one of the key causes of continuing excessive deficits. And by the way, the excessive deficits in health really started 2015-2016. They began to be around 100 to 200 million under James Riley in 2012-2013, but they catapulted on 2015 onwards to the extraordinary supplementary of 700 million this year. The government now wants to bring back the board of the HSE. And I think you might outline, Taoiseach, if you've accepted the error of your policy in that regard in terms of abolishing that board, you're now going to restore it. What other priorities do you have for structural change, and when will these take effect? And furthermore, mandatory disclosure is a priority for a while now, particularly since the vital check. Is there a specific reason for the ongoing delay in delivering the legislation when there seems to be all party agreement on the same and on the key issue there? And when will the expert group on the public-private mix in health report? Do you accept, Taoiseach, that there are far too many vacancies in the mental health area and that this is a significant problem which hasn't been met to date? And also in terms of social care provision recommendations of Sláinte care, particularly the universal palliative care recommendation, can you indicate whether anything has started in relation to the implementation of that? 50 million recommended by Sláinte care over the next 5 years for palliative care. Do you intend to do anything to accelerate, to start that process?
Response from Taoiseach.
Thanks very much. A lot of questions there last Carlisle, but I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. First of all, in relation to the Magdalene redress scheme, the government has accepted the Ombudsman report. We did that last May. The Minister for Justice and I met with the Ombudsman after he gave his evidence at the Joint Oireachtas Committee, and I was struck by his evidence too. He's a mild-mannered man, not known to condemnation, and when he criticises a government department in the way he does, there are a lot of people who criticise every day of the week. He's somebody who, when he makes criticisms, you really want to listen to them, because he's a very measured man and a very competent public servant. And on foot of that appearance at the JOC, I asked to meet him with the Minister for Justice. We considered his report and have accepted it in full. And that report recommended that we extend the Magdalene scheme to women who weren't resident in Magdalene laundries but lived nearby, often in an adjoining institution, and were required to work unpaid in those laundries. So what we're doing at the moment is paying the compensation to those women. The way the scheme works is that's based on being paid for work that you weren't paid for in the past. So that's why the question is there about how many hours you worked or how many days you worked. It's only there to make sure that we can maximise the amount of money paid to the women who are making an application. It's not there in any way to try and restrict it. And we do fully appreciate that, given the passage of time, it could be very difficult for anyone to remember how many hours they worked somewhere 30 or 40 years ago. So that's not there to try and catch people out. It's there to try and work out how many hours, how many days people worked in the laundry, so we can calculate how much they're being compensated. But I can absolutely guarantee you that nobody is going to be left short. We're trying to give people the payment they deserve. We agreed at Cabinet today to pass primary legislation to extend the medical card and other health-related supports to those women. We had hoped to be able to do that without primary legislation. It does require primary legislation. That was approved at Cabinet today, and I'd ask for the cooperation of all members of this House in getting that legislation through quickly, certainly if we can get it done this session. I'd ask members to cooperate, and every time members are demanding that time be set aside for X, Y or Z, bear in mind you're having the knock-on effect of delaying other important legislation too. So you can 1 minute demand more time for X and then the next minute complain that Y isn't happening. So I'd ask for members to be sensible when it comes to the use of Dáil time, and let's use our Dáil time to get necessary legislation done, not making statements and speeches, and that's what I'd ask for from members here. In terms of Deputy Howlin asked about which reforms are being overseen by the division. Different divisions oversee different reforms. I can't remember exactly where they all fall. I think this one, which is under Assistant Secretary Liz Canavan, is overseeing the reforms of the Department of Justice, also the Garda reforms, and also the Sláinte reforms. Of course, they're mainly led by the line departments, but it is the role of my department and the Cabinet subcommittees to oversee them. In relation to the public sector and to recruitment in the public sector, and also in relation to nursing, I think it's important to acknowledge that recruitment and retention is a challenge across the economy. It's a challenge from fruit farms to the ITC sector. It's a challenge in the public sector as well. When you approach full employment, inevitably recruitment and retention becomes difficult because there are so many job opportunities out there. And when it comes to health, it's an international recruitment and retention challenge that every country is facing. It's there in the NHS, it's there in Germany, it's there in America too. Notwithstanding that, we have been able to recruit an extra 700 nurses in the last year. An extra 1,500 nurses have joined the payroll in the past 2 years. And if you don't believe me, just look at the Public Sector Pay Commission report, page 57, details the number of nurses in the country has increased every year for the past 4 years. And those are nurses hired by the state. We also have 5,000 more teachers than 2 years ago, and we've 600 more Gardaí than 2 years ago. So notwithstanding the recruitment and retention challenge, we do have more nurses, more Gardaí and more teachers this year than last year, and many more than 2 years ago. And often that doesn't come across, but that is a fact. In terms of public sector pay, we have a pay deal. We're in the first year of a 3-year deal with the public service. That involves pay increases this year. In fact, a pay increase was just paid in October. It involves pay increases next year. In fact, 2 pay increases for staff who earn less than 30,000, and a special increase for recent entrants in March. But there is a limit to how much the government can do, and there's a limit to how much taxpayers can afford. There's an extra $1 billion for the health service next year. Already over €300 million of that is earmarked for public sector pay increases. The rest, I hope, will go into services, will go into new drugs, equipment, new buildings, new medicines, new services. And I don't want all of that money eaten up in pay increases and pay claims. We need to get the balance right. There's already very significant resources going into pay increases for public servants next year, and I don't want us to get in a situation whereby we have to start curtailing our plans for service improvements next year, taking money away from patients and away from students and away from users of public services to increase public sector pay even more than we've already agreed. That wouldn't be the right thing to do.